All right, Guru Nation, we are on part 5 for those keeping track at home, although I don't blame you if you're not, because who can possibly do that? Even I didn't know it's number 5, but this is like arbitrarily a 10-part series that I came up with on how to this one is like the golden era of clinical research sites. I believe we are in the golden era of clinical research sites. I think we were into a 10-year stretch here, and this is video number 5 of what I think is a 10-part series. Although, trust me, this theme is not going away. So this will ultimately be just one of many videos and podcasts on sites and how we are in the golden era of sites. So, we are in the golden era of sites. And in this particular episode, I'm going to be discussing how to build a clinical site network that attracts sponsors and investors, which is literally what I am trying to do here in Yuma Clinical Trials. I'm almost 4 years into my journey here with Yuma Clinical Trials. I came out here in July of 21. We got our first study around December of 21. So it's closer to 3.5 years of doing this, because right now it's May of 25. Point is, I've came out here to build a site for the community because I knew it was underserved, not because I'm Mother Teresa, but because I knew the fundamentals of how to do it, and I knew that it would be something of value to both sponsors, patients, physicians, and the community at large. I mean, the people that we're able to provide jobs for in this town, and the physicians were able to provide extra income opportunities for their support staff, extra opportunities for them. So there is a need in underserved communities, but I think that you can make the argument there's a need in just about every community if you niche down enough for having a research site. And the last episode was how standalone research sites are dying. So they're going to either be forced to join networks or get absorbed by other networks or just go out of business. And I do think that in the next decade, you're going to see a lot of consolidation. And so if you want to be the one writing the script, you want to build the site network, and you want to attract sponsors and investors. So if you want sponsors to come to you, and if you want investors to chase you, you have to stop thinking like a one-off site and start thinking like an infrastructure company. So scale matters. And what's killing standalone sites, which are 90% of sites right now as of the time of this episode, in May of 2025, 90% of sites are still standalone subscale, meaning they haven't built their infrastructure. Sponsors want predictability, speed, and diversity. They don't want risk. They take enough risk. We have Darshan Kulkarni, who's a regular guest on the episodes, and he said running a pharmaceutical company is like going to the casino every day, putting $2 million on every day, not seeing the results of your bet every day, and doing that for 10 years. And if you're lucky, at the end of those 10 years, you will win. And most of the time you won't. And then you do it again and again and again. So sponsors take on plenty of risk as is. The last thing they want is a risky site. So sponsors are completely on board. And this is why it's important what sponsors want, because sponsors are the ones that ultimately fund this whole industry. I was talking to David LaHaye today, who's a serial site owner. He's already sold a site to a network. He's currently in the process of building another site. He's building another site network now with McAllen Clinical Research in Texas. Very similar community to Yuma. And he's saying that the ceiling to progress is complexity, and having standardization means taking risk off the table for the sponsors. So that's the first thing you want to do, is you want to think like a business person. And one of the books I recommend is called The E-Myth by Michael Gerber, and he released a revised version a couple years back, The E-Myth Revisited. And it's a fantastic way to think about every process of your business as a separate business entity. So McDonald's is the example in that book. McDonald's is not in the business of selling burgers. They're in the business of selling franchises. And if you want to build a site network, you're not really in the business of clinical research. You're in the business of essentially replicating your model in other geographic areas, other therapeutic areas. That's a true site network. So one of the things we've done in Yuma, we haven't expanded outside of Yuma, but we have repeated our model. We started out with an internal medicine physician. We then moved to a dermatologist. We then incorporated a psychiatrist. We then incorporated a pulmonologist. We then incorporated a cardiologist. And now this year we just got a nephrologist and a gastroenterologist. So we are replicating our system, and we are building our infrastructure so that each time we bring on a new PI, we're not reinventing the wheel. We have standardized infrastructure. So we have obviously our SOPs, standard operating procedure, but ultimately that is what sponsors see, and what you really need for your site is infrastructure for your business process. So specifically, like, what tech stacks do you use? And in the case of my site, we use Creo, we use Patient Ace, and we just adopted Monday.com, who's not a sponsor. Maybe we'll work on getting Monday.com as a sponsor. Actually, Daniel, we got to get Monday.com as a sponsor, man. That's on my to-do list. So we started using Monday.com, and it streamlines the workflows in Creo. So that's our tech stack so far. Now, whatever your tech stack is what's going to work for you. And maybe when you're building this infrastructure, not everything works for every PI, but you really want to focus on the form of how you're doing things, because you want it repeatable and you want scale. You don't want to be subscale. You want to be able to scale. Investors, especially private equity, are hunting for platform plays. Sponsors obviously want predictability. There was a report that came out recently that says site networks will be the backbone of clinical development by 2030. So I agree. I think we're in the beginning of a golden decade of clinical research sites. And I think roughly 2030, I think, will be the peak of this, but I think it lasts till about 2035. So you're not just building sites, you're building systems. And this is, again, the E-Myth Revisited is a great book I've mentioned several times on this podcast. Now, there's different growth strategies. You can be like me, what I did with Yuma Clinical Trials. I think most of you would do this. If you have some money, if you have connections to investors, which we'll get into, you can go the route of acquiring sites and you becoming the platform. But I think de novo, starting a new site from scratch, that's what we did with our hub and spoke model at Yuma Clinical Trials, where we have different providers. The majority have their own private practice, but some we're not allowed to utilize their private practice, either because they sold their private practice and no longer own it, or because they are an employee for a private practice and they're not allowed to do it on their private practice, research being it. So we have a hub and spoke model where we have our standalone research site, but then that's the hub, but then every spoke is its own clinic when it's appropriate. And it's basically a hybrid model in that sense. But you have one of the pros of having a de novo site is full control over your SOPs, your tech stack, your culture, your branding, We are essentially, me and the core employees that are with me during this growth phase, we are picking the tech stack that we like. I'm taking suggestions from everyone. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's my call, me and my business partners, but they defer to me. But I take suggestions from the employees. And if you're an employee watching this, one of the benefits of working at a smaller site, like a startup, is it is riskier, but the upside is you get to be a part of something potentially big, something that scales. And these days, I don't think you build a research site without thinking about scaling in mind, just because the prize is so big, and that's going to continue to increase. So you're going to see more competition, I think, wherever you are in any market, and you're going to want to scale. And I've never acquired a site before. I've taken over sites from former businesses. Those were never acquisitions. Those were more just taking over and completely gutting and refurbishing the systems in place. And this was kind of before tech really became involved. Nowadays, if you can figure out a good tech stack, and there's constantly innovations on the vendor side as far as tech, it's a really exciting time to be an entrepreneur, especially if you're one that likes to experiment. So I think having a de novo site, starting a brand new site, is the way to go. Also, very little money needs to be used in that regard. Like, you can literally start a site with no money. Someone was asking me on Instagram, how much do I need to start a site? You can actually do it with very little to no money. You need an office. So you generally, a private practice will be enough to get you started until you can afford to get your own space. I did an entire podcast on how I did it, and it's on my YouTube channel under the fundamentals. The cons of doing this is it's a slow ramp up. So it can take 18 to 24 months to become profitable. That was probably exactly, the 18-month was probably exactly the time for Yuma Clinical Trials to get our first dividend as owners. We were profitable before that, and we decided to reinvest the profits into employees and the infrastructure. A lot of it is human resource related, but increasingly now and over the next decade, it's going to be more technologically enabled resources, but you're going to have your choice. It's bring your own tech, BYOT, and you're going to be able to have freedom and choose what tech stacks you want. It's harder to get sponsor feasibility list with no track record as a PI. It gets a lot easier once you have one PI. All your new PIs that sign up, you can put them, you have the advantage now to have studies under your existing PI and list them as sub-investigators, and ultimately get them up to speed with research experience to be principal investigators. And then you can start going to places like Inato, which is one of my sponsors, where you can get studies for free, but you need therapeutic area expertise. So those are the cons. Now, acquisition, I've never acquired a site. I would do it with private equity backing. So part of my goal here with Yuma Clinical Trials, and if you're a private investment firm, I'd be happy to talk to you. We want to be the platform site. We know we can attract other sites across the country, and we can try to find similar models to Yuma, where it's underserved, diverse population. They're becoming increasingly harder to find geographic regions like this. I mentioned Rio Grande in Texas. It's actually getting competitive now with multiple research sites, but there still are places throughout the country, and they don't always have to be on the border. So having a diverse geography doesn't always have to mean Hispanic. There's African American, there's Asian American, there's Arab American, there's a lot of diversity you can have. There's Native American, where you don't have to necessarily be on a border town. And acquisition would be appealing to me if I'm trying to build the site network. And I've you're never going to perfect your model, but you're comfortable enough with your platform model, which in my case would be Yuma, Arizona, to replicate this somewhere else. And at that point, you can do both. You can start sites like a de novo site from scratch. You can locate the talent in those areas, the PIs, and the entrepreneurs, and or because I'm about both, acquiring sites that make sense. And I think if I'm playing with my own money or I'm playing with an investor's money, I think the arbitrage and the value still is finding a site where the EBITDA is not quite attractive enough to a traditional private equity fund, but with a few tweaks, like putting the right infrastructure in place, you can get that EBITDA higher. And then you can attract more therapeutic areas, and you can share resources. For example, things like Patient ACE, integrations and workflows from Creo and Monday.com, or whatever the newest thing is by then. Maybe Tilda somehow with AI, because AI is coming. AI is going to become a force, and a huge force multiplier going forward. Now, the cons to, let's go with the pros for acquiring first. Instant revenue and sponsor relationships. So that's another way to get the immediate ROI from your acquisition. I would want immediate ROI on my acquisition. Experienced investigators and CRCs, especially when you have staff that are willing to relocate and put their boots on the ground, and you put in an incentive model where they kind of get that site up and running and get the faster path to that EBITDA scaling, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Now, the cons are integration headaches, different tech, different SOPs, different cultures. This is why you go for the lower earning EBITDA, because it's easier to change culture in a smaller company than it is in a bigger company. Matter of fact, I would stay away from the bigger companies unless they are in some therapeutic niche that I don't have expertise in, like let's say rare disease or oncology, although we're going to try to get oncology here in Yuma as well. Now, the hybrid model, which I mentioned, I would open both de novo sites almost for free, and then I would acquire low EBITDA or maybe even slightly negative EBITDA sites. I would acquire them and turn it into a hybrid model, kind of like what I did with the hub and spoke, but on the site network level. And this gives you the best of both worlds, and that's what we're kind of looking for as investors and entrepreneurs. Now, 2 episodes ago in the series, I had a whole thing about what sponsors want, but let's just recap really quick because it's important to get into the next stage of what investors want. So sponsors want consistency across sites. Same SOPs, same data entry, same query resolution speed. They want to know, hey, we like your site in Yuma. If we give the same study to your site in El Paso, will we get the same quality of work? And they want me to confidently demonstrate, not just say, but demonstrate yes. And you do that by scaling and by sharing infrastructures, and this is what sponsors are looking for. They don't want risk. They take plenty of risk. They want the fast startup times. The best benefit back in the day with the site management organizations, which is now taken over by the site networks, you had fast startup times, streamlined startup regulatory, streamlined site training, and streamlined contracts and budget negotiations. So you got dedicated startup teams. You can do a lot with a centralized team that you can't do with just a standalone site. So there are economies of scale, and there are force multipliers when it comes to the tech and the shared systems. Patient access, again, geographic and demographic diversity. Does your company have a NAC and a core competency of attracting a certain demographics to your studies. Obviously, the more the better. Enrollment performance, not just site activation, but actual reliable enrollment metrics and demographic data. Everything is data driven now. Used to be hypothesis driven, now it's data driven with multiple mini hypotheses built around that data. And then the tech readiness. So, site networks offer sponsors greater operational predictability through standardized best practices. Now, what are investors looking for? I kind of discussed, but let's go through it. They want to see something that has the potential to be scaled. Like, I'm going to now look at this through the lens and discuss through the lens of I am the platform company, I have private equity backing. What do I look for in a site? I'm going to be priced out because I want my money to go further than my competitors. So I'm going to take out high earning EBITDA sites. I want sites that are not yet scaling, but are going to be able to scale. But some investors may want sites that have already demonstrated their capabilities of scaling. It just depends where in the process of the site network are you in. If you're joining a site network early on, there is more risk up front for you to join the site network early on as opposed to later. But there's also more earnings potential early on as opposed to later. This is why, with all things being considered, my age, my financial situation, my core competencies, and my team's core competencies, I think we are better served to be the platform, or at least very early on in the process of the site network, where we still have the hands in molding the site network as opposed to the tail end of it. So if you're on the tail end of it and you want to sell your site to a site network, you want to already be scaled. But I would look, if I'm an investor, which I think pretty soon I will be, a site that hasn't quite figured it out but is not that far from scaling. And the parts where they're lacking is where we can immediately from day one come in and offer instant value add, almost with the turn of a switch. Now, nothing happens that easily, but that's what they want. I would be looking for breaking even, but demonstrate a track record that the PI is able to get repeat interest from sponsors. I personally wouldn't care so much about EBITDA. I think I would want actually sub $1 million EBITDA because I think I can scale those sites quicker. Above the 1 million, like the $1 to $3 million EBITDA, that's the sweet spot for most of the investors. And I think that makes sense for them because they're not necessarily, at least the less sophisticated ones are not, their core competency is not necessarily training, it's more financial arbitrage. Whereas some of the more mature site networks like SynXL that just sold a week ago to a hedge fund for $1.5 billion, that's billion with a B, they clearly have demonstrated that they know what they're doing when it comes to absorbing sites. And they did that with 18 sites, by the way. It wasn't like they did it with 180 sites. They did it with 18 sites. So there's a lot of ways to do this as an investor, and I think that's one of the ways that I would personally do it. I would want therapeutic diversification. So if I'm doing the one thing I don't see getting into in Yuma, just because of the dynamics here with the regional hospital, there are no independent private practice physicians doing OBGYN. So I don't see in the near future, unless an independent OBGYN moves to town and agrees to do research with me, I don't see us getting into OBGYN research unless we strike a deal with the hospital, in which case changes the entire strategy. But that's maybe another podcast with health systems getting involved in research. If I were to acquire a site outside of Yuma, I would look for OBG in addition to all the other stuff that we do have so that we can kind of pair and mix those things. I would want geographic density, easier recruitment in the bigger cities, but also breadth, resilience against regional saturation, which is Yuma. We may not have the density of a Chicago, but we have the resilience against regional saturation that Chicago and Houston and Miami have. And then you want the exit potential. So this is why I want the lower EBITDA sites if I were an investor. And then I would want to look to see who's my strategic exit player. Now, the core elements of a sponsor and investor ready site network. Clearly, this is where everything comes together. This is where all the value add gets locked in. This is where 1 + 1 = 3, where you have true synergies, where you have economies of scale. You want the unified SOPs, and that reduces retraining and sponsor audit risks. You want the centralized tech stack. You absolutely want to do everything uniform while allowing your regional site directors. I think M3 Wake, from what I've discussed with them at SOS, I think they do this well. They encourage their site directors to experiment with new things on the market. And if something works, where they have their all hands-on meetings every week amongst the site directors, they look into it at adopting it at a corporate level. I think that's smart. I think that's the best of both worlds. I think that's keeping the advantages of being a larger organization while allowing for the nimbleness of the smaller ones. You want a recruiting machine. So obviously recruiting is a very local sport, but you want systems in place. Patient Ace is a perfect example. And the thing about Patient Ace, yes, I am one of the co-founders, so this is a shameless plug. But Ronick was smart in the fact that he got everything to be integrated with the other systems, so it plays well with Creo. And you can integrate Patient Ace into Creo, and you can even have patients schedule themselves their own pre-screening appointments. And it's all automated, and it's some AI in there, but it's not even really the crazy AI that everyone's talking about. It's just a ubiquitous type that kind of allows simple workflows to get done passively. Then you want the dedicated startup contracts and quality assurance teams. So you're becoming a little bit like a CRO in a way, where you have the dedicated teams. There's no bottlenecks here between site selection and SIV. You have full transparency. The workflows are integrated so you can see where the bottlenecks are. This is one of the reasons why I do like Monday.com. I think that there's some promise there as far as workflow and working your way through bottlenecks. And then training and retention systems. So I'm tired of losing coordinators to CRAs, to becoming CRAs. If you run a site network, your coordinators can graduate to being the QA specialists. I even told one of our coordinators this recently. I don't want to lose you to IQVIA or somewhere. I want to train you how to do QA so that when we become the site network, you can go travel and be our monitor to the other sites. And this prevents staff turnover. This gives your staff options, allow them to grow in the system. Ultimately, this is what the CROs have been doing. Historically, this has been their core competency, which some of the site networks are taking over. Now, there's strategic focus areas, right? There's geography, there's demographics, there's therapeutic breadth. So geographic density, I've mentioned it, but 3 to 5 sites within driving distance supports shared recruiters, CRAs, startup staff. We do this in Yuma. We actually have a hub and spoke model, so we don't count them as different sites, but we do have different clinics with investigators. Then you want to target diverse populations, so urban, suburban, high Hispanic, Black, Asian, Arab Americans, etc., and then therapeutic breadth. So you want to cover the big stuff. Right now it's GLP-1s are all the rage, but you want also NASH, you want metabolic, you want CNS, you want vaccines, you want general medicine, derm, respiratory. You want to avoid being overly narrow. And I know a lot of sites, they have relied on vaccine studies over the years because there's basically like an ATM that prints money if you had a vaccine study. The problem is you get overly dependent on one therapeutic area, and when there's a regime shift or maybe a policy change in the form of moving away from vaccines or making those studies more stringent, that revenue is kind of phantom. And as an investor, I would avoid sites that are just too narrowly focused, unless that narrow focus is something stable like a CNS. CNS has historically been one of the most stable over the decades, like an oncology. In those cases, I'm willing to make an exception. Mistakes to avoid when building a network: buying sites just because they're available. They got to fit your geography, your culture, your tech readiness. Another mistake is letting every site kind of run independently. Chris and I do this with DSCS. It's not a real site network. Sites pay us a monthly fee. It's like a subscription model to help them with business development and contract development and some operational consulting and advising. But if you're talking a true site network with centralized operations, etc., I would not just say yes to every site that wants to join your network, because that's going to get you into a lot of issues like neglecting internal leadership. You're going to need chief operating officers, directors of startup, recruiters, feasibilities, contracts, and budgets. This is why when things get overly complex, you have to find the simplicity within the complexity. Leonardo da Vinci said it himself, then Steve Jobs borrowed from it. It's taking something that's complex and making it simple again after you've mastered the complexity. And then underestimating the integration time and cost. I would assume 12 to 18 months to fully integrate acquired sites into your platform. Maybe less with de novo sites. At that point, you have just more of an issue of getting the PI's experience, but the timetable is going to be roughly the same thing, right? So you're not getting too many benefits from acquiring versus building, other than having an existing runway as opposed to starting from a complete standstill. Now, sponsors are starting to pick site networks, not standalone sites. I think that's going to continue. Yes, we're going to have problems. Yes, we're going to have some fluctuations where sponsors are more hesitant which site networks they're going to go with, and branding is going to become a very important issue. But when you have billion-dollar site networks now, like SynXL, you have the attention of the sponsors to where, hey, we're going to get predictability out of this, and we're lowering our risk. Investors are looking for clinical trial infrastructure. They're looking for synergies, ways that they can fit in well with that site. There would be sites that I would say no to acquire today, because I know if I acquire that site, I'm acquiring an existing culture that may not mesh well with what's worked well for me. And rather than trying to spend time to figure out all that, which one's good, what's not good, and spending a lot of money on acquiring that site, I'd rather almost do a de novo or do a site that has the raw ingredients but not the integration, and be able to take it from there. Build your own network, I think, is the way to go. Join a network, I think it's the way to go. I think this is your life, your business. You figure it out. Figure out the patient recruitment. Listen, the 4 virtues of running a site, right? The operations, the contract and budget, the business development, and the patient recruitment. That's it. This is, in essence, I think if you follow this plan, this is the way to go for how to grow your site network, how to build into a site network, and how to maybe exit into a site network. This is choose your own adventure style video and my thoughts on it. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Let me know what you're thinking about this, and we'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye. Hey, if you guys like that kind of content, make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share. Stay tuned for more videos.